Hello and welcome to Agri History. In this episode, we'll talk about apricots. The apricot, also known as Prunus armeniaca, is considered one of the most delicious of the temperate fruit crops. The apricot has been cultivated for thousands of years within the hills of Asia, and at least 2,000 years in Europe. Apricot has many uses. It can be used as fresh fruit or for drying. The Chinese in ancient times even smoked and salted apricots. In an area called Hubei within China, black smoked apricots were famous. Within baked goods, apricot jam was used extensively for cakes, in the form of glazes and adhesive layers. In the Middle East, apricots are used in cooking savory dishes, especially ones with lamb. In ancient times, apricot seeds were also used for flavoring agents. In Japan, the Japanese apricot is used for ornamental flowers, and their fruit are used for pickling and juice making. Although apricots are awesome as a fruit, they are limited by an ecological trait. Apricots require uniformly cold winters, frostless springs, and hot summers. And relatively few people have worked on apricot research in comparison with other fruit crops. And few comprehensive scientific literature reviews have been made. Apricots occupy a genetic location between plums and peaches. Apricots can be grafted onto peach and plum rootstock and can be crossbred with both species. For a little over 1,700 years, apricots were considered a type of early peach. Crescentius described the apricot as part of the peach group and not a separate fruit group in 1518. In 1551, Dr. Turner called apricot the hasty peach tree. In the 1700s, a researcher by the name of Tournefort, court botanist of King Louis XIV, separated the peach and the apricot into two separate genera. The famous Dr. Linnaeus then placed the apricot into the Prunus genus, alongside cherries, plums, and peaches. During this time period, many species were named within the apricot species. These species are now categorized mostly as subspecies, or varieties of apricot. This is due to the limited differences between many of the subspecies within the general apricot group. For convenience sake, I'll label each group with a letter to make it easier to follow. The first, Prunus armeniaca, subspecies siberica, will be labeled Group A. Prunus armeniaca, subspecies Manchuria, will be labeled Group B. Prunus armeniaca, variety Ansu, will be labeled Group C. Prunus mumei will be labeled Group D. Prunus brigantia will be labeled Group E. Prunus deis carpa will be labeled Group F. And Prunus armeniaca variety holoracea will be labeled subspecies G. Group A, found in Siberia, is either a bush or a small tree, with white or pink flowers. Fruit are practically inedible. Group B is found in Manchuria. It is a large tree that goes up to 20 meters high. Large white or pink flowers with 25 millimeter long yellow fruit with sweet flavor. This tree is very hardy, with an extended flowering period. Group C is known as the Ansu apricot. The fruit tree is bush-like. Group C, earlier pink flowers and red fruit. The fruit are also freestone and sweet. It is cultivated in China, Japan, and Korea, where winter is mild. Group D has flowers that are very fragrant and very ornamental in shape. The fruit are small and yellow with dry flesh. Group E has light pink flowers and barely edible fruit. But the seeds were used for making oil that was considered better than olive oil. Group E is actually a hybrid between an apricot and a plum, specifically Prunus cerasifera. Flowers are long and showy, with fruit that are dark purple and tart. Group F is known as the Tibetan apricot. Very few samples are found so far. It has small fruit with bitter seeds. Within apricots, there are variants that have ornamental value. These have been given the designation F. There are variants with pendulous twigs, variegated leaves, and heart-shaped leaves, and egg-shaped leaves. There are also examples of hybrids between plums and apricots. These are called cot plums and plum cots. Eugene Simon bred the first ones and sent them from China to France prior to 1872. Luther Burbank later produced plum cots by crossbreeding Japanese plum with apricot. He had bred 65 to 75,000 seedlings of plum cot, with none of the seedlings being pure-blood apricot or plum in nature. Every possible combination of plum and apricot traits were found within this lineage. The first plum cot introduced to commercial production was called Roofland. The fruit was the size of an ordinary apricot with deep purple skin and red flesh. The flavor was like a mixture of apricot and plum. There have also been several cultivars made by breeding Japanese apricot with plum, called Sumomo Ume. There have also been crossbreeds between apricot and almond, several plum species with apricot, and peach with apricot. Now let's talk about how the apricot was distributed throughout its history. The scientific name Armeniaca may indicate that it originated in Armenia. It was believed that Alexander the Great brought apricots from Armenia to Greece, and from there it reached Rome and Italy. But, based on historical writings, apricots were unknown in that same time period as Alexander the Great. It also seemed to be unknown in Rome. However, the Armenian apple was also mentioned in Roman historical documents. This seems to indicate that it arrived in Rome in 1st century AD. Based on the work Historia Naturalis, written by Pliny, it was most likely that Armenians brought apricots to Rome and they did not arrive from Greece. Now the origin point for European apricots is not fully known. This is because apricots were cultivated all throughout Asia. A researcher known as Harlan described the apricot as being native to Kabul or Afghanistan, with the primitive versions being yellow, acidic, with poor fruit quality. That researcher also encountered 5 different types of apricot, one of which was so delicate that it broke apart if even the slightest pressure was used. According to another researcher known as Moorcroft, in Pakistan there are 10 types of apricot cultivated, all raised from seed except one, which was propagated by budding. The apricot was also found in Islamic gardens. Al-Biruni in 1050 provided a list of fruit, of which the apricot is included. According to a researcher named Hedrick in the 1900s, the apricot was cultivated all throughout the East, from Kashmir, northern India, China, Japan, and parts of northern Africa, all the way down to southern Europe and Damascus. The apricot was especially cultivated around Damascus. Due to being widespread around that area and around Africa, it was estimated that the apricot originated in an area near Niger and Atlas. In the oases of Upper Egypt, a fruit called mishmish was dried in large quantities for consumption and commerce. And someone known as D. Regner saw what was thought to be wild apricots in those oases, indicating that mishmish was an apricot. A researcher by the name of D. Condole suggests that these apricots were not wild but have been grown from discarded seeds of cultivated apricot. So the basic route is apricots started in Middle Asia and moved into the Middle East, then to Egypt and North Africa. This domesticated branch produced the cultivars Kalbi, Baladi, Luzi, and Bedri. There's also a branch that led to Greece and the middle of southern Europe. This branch requires a significant amount of chilling to produce fruit. This group is what many of the Californian, South African, and Australian varieties are descended from. In the East, Siberian apricots were disseminated throughout the colder regions due to their exceptionally cold, hardy nature. Based on the research of Crosa Reynold, the apricot entered Russia from the west, but the Ukraine, Crimea, and Caucasian area, and Turkestan obtained their apricots from the Middle East directly. There's also a major entry into Europe by the apricot through Turkish involvement. Archaeological evidence suggests that the apricot was in Hungary in Roman times, as well as in a Roman settlement known as Aquincum. Apricot seeds have been found in that area, dating back to the 1st century. Apricot seeds were also found in a 9th century grave in an area I cannot pronounce, but it's also in Hungary. Apricots were also found in the 14th century Hungarian dictionary. This indicates that apricots were in Hungary before the 16th century. However, apricot production increased when the Turkish folk occupied Hungary. And because of that, even today, apricot is still predominant in Hungary. Since Turkish apricots were superior in flavor to European cultivars at the time, there was large trade between interested parties who were growing apricot at the time. And the influence of Hungarian apricots caused an increase in apricot production in Western Europe. At that time, England had very few apricots, but Germany grew a fair amount. During the 17th century, a cardinal of Hungary imported nursery stock of apricot directly from Turkey. Hungary then developed at least 4 cultivars and several landrace-like populations of apricot. Apricot populations were increased further in the 18th century, due to the tolerance of sandy soil that apricots and plums have, thus reducing the negative environmental effects of sand blowing on agricultural land. In Italy, apricots are grown south of Naples along with other fruit species. By the 1600s, 9 cultivars of apricot were described in Italy. Although due to not being mentioned in Alexander Brackey's Book of 100 Plants, it can be speculated that the apricots of Italy were not good enough for commercial production. It's also known that apricots were grown all throughout Europe, due to the fact that apricot seeds were found in Austria that date back to the 1st century. Apricots were also introduced to France prior to the year 1000 AD. This was done by the Arabs. Apricots did not move into the north until 440 years later. This is due to the fact that apricots from the south are unsuitable for the north. It is suspected that Hungary was the source of the French cultivars that exist in the north. This is due to the fact that apricots adapt perfectly well to very specific climates, and each group has its own specific climate it can survive in. Apricots were introduced to Spain by the Arabs, who conquered Spain between 711 and 719 AD. 12th century manuscripts mention apricots, and a book on agriculture compiled by Ibn Basil in 1000 AD likewise describes many fruit including apricots, adding further evidence that apricots were in Spain for a long time. And apricot production and cultivar breeding increased from 1910 to 1967. Now, the origin of English apricots happened in the 15th century. During this time, Italy had traded with England, and England obtained Italian apricots. Cultivars from Africa and possibly France were also obtained. It is from these cultivars that brand new British cultivars were bred. In time, a cultivar known as Moor Park was bred. Due to Moor Park's superior quality of fruit, it became the mainstay of apricot production in England. Now, as for worldwide production, the Spanish brought apricots to Mexico. The English established apricots in Virginia. Within the United States, many new types were bred, but they never obtained a foothold in much of America, except for California and parts of Oregon and Utah, as well as Washington. Further introductions of apricot happened from Russian Mennonites, who brought apricots from Russia to Nebraska. If we go back to California, this state obtained more and more English and French apricots. This allowed California to become one of the biggest apricot producers in the world. John Van Riebeck, one of the first settlers in the Cape of Africa, introduced apricots to that region. Within Canada, British Columbia, one of our provinces, mirrors California in terms of history of production of apricot, becoming the primary source of apricot production. But there's also small-scale production of apricot in Ontario. These apricots were introduced by Russian settlers, and they thrive near the shores of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Apricots were introduced by the first settlers of Australia, and have remained popular ever since. Now let's talk about improvement of the cultivars of apricot. Right now, most of the breeding work in apricots is happening in the Ukraine, in public institutions. The primary goal right now is improved environmental tolerance of the species, alongside better fruit quality and resistance to disease. There's not much else going on in breeding production, however. This concludes the episode of Apricot. Stay tuned for Season 2 of Agri-History. In the next season, we'll talk about blueberries, the Rubus genus, and strawberries. Until then, have a good one.